After yesterday's episode on the 150 years of the Meteorological Society of Canada, you have to bet that they know their history. So, for Environment Canada to name today's story the top weather story of 2019, you know it had to be next level. Hi, I'm Chris May, host of This Day in Weather History, a podcast from the Weather Network in Canada. The record-setting flooding along the Ottawa River was named Canada's top weather story in 2019, and it happened this day in weather history.
They say this is going to be the worst. The worst we've seen so far was the flood 2 years ago in 2017.
Back in 2017, the Ottawa River had what was called, quote, flood of the century. Yeah, that'll teach you to make such big proclamations so soon into a century, because the 2019 year's flooding along the Ottawa River was, quote, bigger than the 2017 event that was then considered the flood of the century, end quote. That coming from Environment Canada, backtracking on the 2017 proclamation, and that just makes me giggle.
This water, right now it's approximately at 60.25 centimeters above sea level. It's slated to go to 60.9. So that's about 3/4 of a meter.
Yeah. On May 1st, the Ottawa River crested 30 centimeters, roughly a foot above the 2017 peak flood levels. As an immediate response to this, Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson issued a state of emergency on April 25th. It was lifted on June 12th. That's a long time to be in a state of emergency. The irony is that within only months, we'd be back into several months and months and months of more states of emergency, so this was really a bad time for Ottawa all the way around. As a matter of fact, it had been a bad century already for the river region, the 21st century. We were kind of new. Flooding had already forced evacuations for people on both shores along the Ottawa River in eastern Ontario and the accompanying western Quebec for the second time in only 3 years. Our storm hunter, Mark Robinson, was there, and he was on location in the area between Ottawa and Gatineau.
The last couple of days, we've seen major flooding along the Ottawa River, along the Gatineau River. A lot of these neighborhoods, people are out and helping. I think that's the most heartening thing ever, is simply that there's so many volunteers coming out to try and sandbag, try and give a hand. I'm going to be doing that a little later on this episode.
The Canadian military was called in to help out in Ottawa, Gatineau, and across the Ottawa Valley with flood relief efforts. Environment Canada says, here's another quote, everything about this year's flood, including its size and duration, was unprecedented. Wow. EC really had some bold things to say about this storm. Oh, and there's more. But first, remember that this day in weather history can be enjoyed a number of ways. Right now, you are listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider, but there is also the daily podcast video short. They are shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective, and oftentimes they will include visuals from that day's event, from when it happened, in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. So what else did Environment Canada have to add to this massive event? Anything explaining perhaps, I don't know why it happened? Actually, yes. Another quote. All the weather ingredients were in place for a catastrophic event, end quote. So what did that include actually? The Ottawa region had already suffered 7 straight months of below normal temperatures, so the ground was frozen solid like concrete, and therefore it took an awful lot longer to thaw. Plus, they also received a total snowfall accumulation that was 50% greater than normal. And what was more were the heavy rains that poured over a 5-week period from mid-April to mid-May. That was the final straw. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. One difference that is noted between 2017 and 2019 was how much slower in 2019 the snow melted. I mentioned that a moment ago. So when the snow finally began to retreat much later in April, it amounted to a sudden and heavier amount of water entering the river system, far more than it could handle. Once again, our storm hunter, Mark Robinson, as he reported live from the affected area back then.
Well, keep in mind that a lot of the rain has fallen on the watershed. That's a huge area north of the city, and all of that water that's fallen out there, all the melt water that's coming from the snow that's been melting, all has to come down through the watershed down to this area, and there's a bit of a delay. So it can stop raining, and those waters will still rise as that pulse of water comes through and eventually empties out into the St. Lawrence River.
And this meant that we saw large amounts of runoff that caused the water levels to rise quickly as the water entered that Ottawa River system. And just like that, boom, we have a flooding event that went off more like a gun. Too much, too fast, because of how slow it took to set up and how late in the season it was this day in weather history. Tomorrow is May 3rd, and it is a grim anniversary, but one that we need to face together as a nation. It was on May 3rd when the first of close to 90,000 Albertans were evacuated in what became a literal hell inferno on earth with the Fort McMurray fires. Now that's tomorrow on This Day in Weather History with me, your host, Chris May.